What's going on, young people? Thank you for joining me for the fourth homework video from Unit 9, Social Psychology. Today we're going to talk about how groups influence you. Being in a group, being part of a group, seeing a group of people, how that impacts your thinking and your behavior. We have a lot of Roman numerals, a lot of bullet points, a lot of new terms we're going to kind of talk through real quick each, all right? I want to start off with the bystander effect, also called the Kitty Genovese effect. You may have heard of the story about Kitty Genovese, a woman who was stabbed to death, as dozens of people watched. No one did anything about it. No one called the police. That's right. Terrible. Sounds awful. Why didn't anyone contact the authorities? Well, what they all thought when they were interviewed was that somebody else surely had called 911, had called the police, was doing something about it. Okay. It's crazy. No one did anything. So the Kitty Genovese effect, also known as the bystander effect, it's when people see something happen or there's some sort of a danger or a threat and no one really does anything about it. Darley and Latane or Latane did this experiment where they had someone sit in a waiting room and then smoke started to come out from behind the door, okay, as if there was a fire. If there was one person in the waiting room by themselves, that person would usually get up and immediately go talk to the secretary, the receptionist, someone at the front desk, like let them know, hey, I think something is wrong. But they did the experiment again where they put multiple people in the waiting room. And what they found is that even with smoke pouring out from underneath the door, even to the point where they were having trouble breathing, no one got up and did anything. Minutes would go by before anybody would act. And what they realized was that when there are more people around, we're actually less likely to do something. Because in our little brains, we think that someone else is going to step up. Okay. If you've ever taken like a CPR class or some sort of training in terms of first responder, medical help, they'll always say, don't shout, can someone help me? Instead, what they say you should do is point to a specific person and say, you in the red shirt, come help me. And they're going to come help because you obviously need help. When you just say, somebody, please call the police. If there's 10 people around, they're all going to be like, oh man, someone should call the police. Like, man, I wonder who's going to do it. But they don't feel like they're responsible, okay? Another way that you see this play out, this idea that with more people around, we actually do less work, is called social loafing. Have you ever done a group project where like no one did their share and the project didn't get done great? That's an example of social loafing. The reason why, connected to the bystander effect, is called responsibility diffusion. Put a star by that point, okay? It's the idea where because there's other people around, nobody feels super responsible for anything, all right? The really fun study they did based on tug of war, okay, where they had someone come into a room and they said, you're gonna play tug of war. So they handed them the rope and then they blindfolded them and said, you are going against one other person, all right? So they pulled the rope and they told them to pull as hard as they could. Then for the other experimental group, they had them come into the room, they were blindfolded, and they said, you're holding a rope, there's 5 people behind you also holding the rope, there's 6 of you, you're going against another team of 6, and they had them hold on to the rope, and then they told them to pull as hard as they could. And what they were measuring, so what in reality, the rope was just tied to an instrument, a machine that measured how hard they were pulling. They weren't actually competing against anybody in either scenario. What they found was that when they were told they were by themselves against one person to pull as hard as they could, they pulled way harder than when they were told they had a team of 5 and they were going up against another team of 6. And both individuals, it's a fascinating thing, they all said they were truly pulling, tugging the rope as hard as they could. So they thought they were trying their best, but in reality, when you're with other people, your brain just kind of feels less responsible, so you don't put in as much effort. That's social loafing. And that's why group projects don't always work. How do we overcome this? You need to divide up the work so that each person is the only one responsible for their task. That's how they feel like they have to do it, because they know that no one else will fix it if they don't. Even when you put people in pairs, they don't work as hard. Now, let's talk about something that's the opposite of social loafing, right? Loafing is when you're lazy. Those words both start with L. When you see loafing, think about being lazy, all right? In contrast, facilitation, social facilitation. To facilitate means to help. Fácil, for those who are taking Spanish, right? Difícil is difficult. Fácil is easy. Facilitation, to make easier, all right? Here's the scenario. There was a factory called the Hawthorne factory. And they wanted to find out, please don't write all this. This is the experiment, okay? The Hawthorne factory wanted to find out if their workers, their employees, would be more productive if they changed the levels of lighting in the factory, all right? So some workers were in spaces that had more light. Some workers were in darker spaces. And some workers were a control group. They didn't really mess with them at all right? And then the experimenters, the researchers would watch the workers to see what happened. What do you think happened? Which group do you think was the most productive? Okay. When there was any change of the lighting, the workers actually became more productive. Like while the experimenters, while the researchers were there, they got more productive. But when the study was done, productivity went back to normal, regardless of the light, regardless of which group they were in. So what did this tell the researchers? It wasn't actually the lighting that had an effect, but being watched, having someone come in and take an interest and observe what you're doing, it actually made them more productive. It made them work harder, more efficient, more effective. This is what social facilitation is. When we are observed, when we are doing simple, easy things that we can do that we're good at, we actually get better at those things. Now, on the flip side, if we think about Yerkes-Dodson law about arousal and how moderate arousal is good for complex tasks, but low arousal is better. So kind of related here. So when you're doing something easy, being watched helps you out because it increases your arousal. But when you're doing something difficult and hard and new for yourself, it's actually the opposite. You actually get worse at that thing when you're being watched. So the Hawthorne effect is the idea that we get better at easy things when we're being watched. But keep in mind, when we're trying to do something really hard, like brain surgery or taking the SAT, something complex and complicated, difficult for you, being watched because it's increasing your arousal, it actually makes you worse at that thing. So social facilitation, when being watched, it helps you out. It makes your task easier. All right, something else that happens in groups. This is the idea of groupthink, okay? The researcher's name is Irving Janis. And here's the idea of groupthink. When you're in a group, you don't think. That's the idea. It's ironic. It's kind of the opposite of what you would think. Groupthink is the idea that when you're in a group, you just kind of go along with what everyone else is saying. And normally this ends up with you making a dumb decision, doing something irrational. This might happen if like you're at work and your boss asks a question and says, hey, I'm thinking about doing this on Saturday. Everyone in the room might be like, oh, cool, good idea, good idea. No one speaks up. They kind of just go with what the boss said. They don't provide new or creative solutions because they want to keep their boss happy. They don't want to be the one person challenging the boss. And in reality, it's possible that everyone in the room is thinking the opposite and knows this is a terrible idea, but nobody speaks up, okay? Some famous examples they'd like to ask about in the AP exam. President John F. Kennedy. There was an invasion of Cuba. Terrible idea. They gave some Cuban exiles some really bad weapons, basically dropped them off and said, hey, go invade Cuba. Terrible idea. A lot of his advisors said that they knew it was a bad idea, but no one was willing to tell him this. Disaster PR nightmare for America, for the White House, for JFK, is because of groupthink. He hadn't really set his advisors, his cabinet up to really be able to share their honest feedback with him, okay? Another example, if you're familiar with the tragedy of the Challenger, the space shuttle that was gonna go up, it launched on a cold day, and the NASA folks, several of them knew that if it was too cold, the O-ring on the ship, when it froze, it cracked, and it could cause problems with the gas with the engines. And some people knew this, but no one was willing to like stand up and challenge their bosses, their managers, the directors, because they were also a little scared of what would happen to them if they spoke up and challenged their superiors. And what ended up happening was the ship exploded shortly after launch, and all the people inside were killed, including a teacher who was on board. Really sad, devastating event. And when they did the follow-up of the investigation, they found that people had known that something was going to go wrong, but no one felt like it was okay for them to speak up. They just kind of went with the flow, and an irrational decision was made. It's one of the most famous examples of groupthink, how people need to speak up. Y'all need to speak up. So here's the idea. The boss says, are we all in agreement? And all the employees are thinking, no, this is a terrible idea, but they kind of go along with groupthink because they don't want to upset anybody, and they don't realize that other people might have some doubts as well. Try and avoid groupthink. Be willing to be the one who speaks up. Okay, so going from groupthink, making irrational decisions, It's kind of related to herd and mob mentality, all right? They did a really fun experiment with kids on Halloween in Seattle, Washington. 27 different houses. There was a bowl of candy in front of each house. And as the kids walked up to the bowl, there was a mirror there. They kind of see their reflection as they walked up to the candy bowl. And the note by the candy bowl said, please take one piece of candy. Nobody was around. And they want to see, would kids take extra candy or not? And they put kids in a few different groups. So some kids, as they walked up to the bowl, a little recording played that said, state your name. Okay. And for some kids, that didn't happen. Some kids went up to the bowl by themselves. Some kids went up to the bowl and they were like in a group with their friends. Okay, so you got 4 groups. Kids who were asked to say their name, who were by themselves. Kids who were asked to say their name, but they were with friends. Kids who were by themselves and they weren't asked to say their name. They just kind of walked up. And kids who were in a group going up. And then also, do you think it mattered whether or not these kids were wearing masks? So take a second, try and guess what % of these kids stole candy. Here are your numbers. The kids who, as they approached, they were by themselves and they were told to state their name. Very few of these kids stole candy, less than 10%. Okay. Now, the kids who were asked to say their name, if they're with their friends, about twice as many of them stole candy, about 20% of them. So being in a group led to more candy stealing. The kids who were by themselves, no name, more of these kids stole candy than the kids who were on their own and asked to state their name. But check out this group. When they were in a group and they were anonymous, over half of the kids took candy. And if those kids were wearing masks, around 90% of them took extra candy. So like being able to hide behind a mask, it actually makes you more likely to do immoral things you wouldn't normally do, okay? They did another experiment. Zimbardo, the guy who did the Stanford prison experiment, he had female college students give shocks to other female students. And half of them were wearing these like hoods that kind of covered their faces with these long white lab coats. Instead of their name, they just had like a number on. The other half, they were not wearing a mask. They had a name tag on with their actual name. And what he wanted to do was figure out who was more likely to give an electric shock. And what they found is that the women who were kind of covered up, again, who were anonymous, who had a number instead of a name, they gave out twice as many shocks. So having this like outfit on, it actually made you more likely to hurt somebody. Now, interesting. They did the experiment a second time with uniformed soldiers, and they thought, okay, people wearing hoods and lab coats, they shocked more. What about when soldiers come in wearing their uniform? And what they found was that wearing the uniform actually led to more shocking than when they took the soldiers and gave them the hoods and the lab coats and the outfits. And what they discovered is that wearing the uniform, it did what the hoods and name tags were doing. Wearing the uniform already promoted what we call de-individuation. They already didn't feel responsible for their actions and behaviors. They already felt like they were part of a group. They had already lost their sense of self-awareness and individualism. So they would just kind of follow orders and do what was told, right? They would shock somebody else. They would shock a stranger when they were wearing their uniform. When they put on the hoods and the name tags, it's almost like they like snapped out of their military obedience mindset, and they kind of reverted to their normal morals and their feelings about whether or not they would shock somebody. So it's interesting how masks and uniforms can make people act in a way they normally wouldn't. We saw this with the Stanford prison experiment, right? The way that the guards and the prisoners had to dress, that impacted the way they thought about themselves. If we talk about why folks if you think about the KKK, the hoods and robes, that's a form of de-individuation. Anytime someone's wearing a mask, there's a famous movie called V for Vendetta, right? Where the characters, when they're wearing masks, are willing to do things they wouldn't normally do. The idea here is that when we are anonymous, when we feel like we're not going to be identified, we're just part of a mob, a group, we'll do things we wouldn't normally do. All right. And this brings us to group polarization. To become polarized, that word means to become extreme, right? We talk a lot about political polarization nowadays, right? We have people who are the extremes, hardcore Democrats, hardcore Republicans, and they totally hate each other. Group polarization is when you are in a group of people, and because you're in that group, your thought process, your decisions become more extreme. You do things and say things and think things that you wouldn't have said and done and thought if you were by yourself, okay? And what happens typically is what we call risky shift. People do things that are riskier when they're with other people. Have y'all ever been out to Settles Bridge? Okay. It's very rare for like a high school student to go to Settles Bridge and illegally jump off the bridge by themselves. It's a dangerous thing to do. Don't do it. Water's not deep enough. Bad things happen every couple of years. It's really sad. Don't do it. All right. But people do it, especially when they're in groups, right? When you're with your buddies, y'all do things that you wouldn't normally do on your own. Some groups feed off of each other. This happened with juries, right? If you're familiar with the story, 12 Angry Men, right? Juries, they become swayed by evidence and they kind of go along with the group, right? When there's strong evidence, they become harsher, more extreme in their opinions. Now, if one person feels incredibly strongly about something, they do have the capacity to sway the whole group. That's what you see in 12 Angry Men. One person who has a strong moral argument, they can sway the group. If they make it clear that they're not going to change their mind, it's almost like the folks in the group are like, I was 80% convinced or 90% convinced, but this person seems 100% convinced. If they're not going to change their mind, I should just go along with them, right? It's almost like groupthink again. They just want to prevent there being conflict. So one person can change the entire group. Be that one person who can help your friends, help your groups make better decisions. All right. The last section here relates to making decisions. Have you ever heard of social traps or the prisoner's dilemma? It comes from the situation where there are two people who are arrested for a crime, and they put them into separate cells. And here's the deal they offer them. They say, if you rat out your buddy, you can get out for free. They'll get 20 years. All right. If neither of you talk, right? If you both remain silent, well, you might be locked up for like a year, but then you'll get out. Right? If you both speak up and rat each other out, you'll both be locked up for 5 years. Okay. So they like let the prisoners know, like, hey, listen, if you don't confess, this could happen to you. Right? They'll say, oh, your buddy is snitching on you. You're gonna get 20 years. You better speak up. You better rat them out. And what ends up happening is it kind of messes with people's thinking, and they end up confessing. And when both people confess, the prosecutors, the cops, they get the information they need. They can charge them both with the crime, and they can have them both locked up. Everyone's fear is that they're going to be taken advantage of. And this is called a prisoner's dilemma. Sometimes it's called a social trap. Okay, it's the idea here that you have to decide: do you cooperate? Right. In this case, you and your buddy stay silent. Do you cooperate, or do you choose to be selfish? In this case, like, do you confess? So a social trap is when being selfish, it seems to help you in the short term, but it's bad for the group. Okay. And what they have found is that typically we treat people the way they have treated us in the past. Right. So in this scenario here, the prisoners, like, their history is going to determine whether they are kind, whether they cooperate with one another, or whether they defect, they are selfish. Reciprocal treatment. This means you treat people the way that they have treated you in the past. Okay. Now, the problem in some cases with social traps is that when everyone chooses to be selfish, it can mess up the whole group. Okay. The tragedy of the commons, if you've taken like environmental science, you might have heard about this. But the idea is that like there's a shared resource that we all need to take care of, but everyone chooses to be a little bit selfish. And what happens is that shared resource disappears. It gets ruined because of the fact that everyone's supposed to be a little bit selfish. Here's a scenario for you. It's called the tragedy of the commons. Imagine that like everyone in the lunchroom decides to leave a piece of trash after lunch. Okay. One person might think to themselves, one piece of trash will make a big difference. Right? They're kind of being selfish. They're being lazy. I don't want to have to go throw this out. I'll just leave it. Not a big deal. But when everybody thinks this way and leaves a piece of trash, ooh, it makes a big difference. They often talk about this with like air quality, water quality, pollution. Everyone thinks that like, oh, me using a little extra water, or producing a little extra trash, that's not going to make a big difference. But when every American thinks this way, it's causing enormous environmental concerns. It's a form of social trap. We need to get better at cooperating with one another. Okay. I want y'all to try a little social trap, a little game here. tinyurl.com/Jones21PD1, Prisoner's Dilemma 1. It only takes a couple of minutes. What happens is you're in a scenario where if you and your opponent both cooperate, you each get 20 points. If you're both selfish, you only get 10 points each. But if you choose to be selfish, if you defect and they cooperate, haha, you get 30 points and they get nothing. But be careful. If you cooperate and they are selfish, you'll get nothing and they'll get 30 points. There are 5 different levels, mechanisms, strategies, opponents, and I want you to see how many points you can earn, okay? I want you to try out a social trap for yourself. So here are the instructions again, tinyurl.com/Jones21, and then PD1, Prisoner's Dilemma 1. I want you to try to earn as many points as you can. We'll talk about this when we are together. Make sure you can answer these 3 questions as well. Out of these different ideas of what happens when we're in groups, what happens most often? Why do you think that would happen most often? Which of these happens the least often? Can you think of an example of when it happens? And then number 3, how do we overcome the laziness from social loafing, the irrationality from groupthink, or the extreme shifts from group polarization? Try and think that through. Appreciate y'all. Peace out.